Hello and welcome. My name is Amy Nernberger, and I am one of the co-chairs of the Education and Training on Handling Research Data Interest Group. For today, we have a fairly limited agenda, but it really packs a lot into it. So I'm so happy that you're here to be part of it. Starting off, we're just going to give a brief introduction and background of what we've been working on and how we're organized if you're not familiar with the work of the group. And then we're going to have two of our main focus groups talk about what they've been working on pretty much for the last 18 months and are really bringing to the community right now to get your final kind of touches and feedback on that, and have some discussion around next steps and implementation in those spaces. And then we're going to close out with our next steps, thinking about where this group goes for its next area of work, so maybe some recommendations, maybe some plans around the Plenary 19. As noted in other spaces, you can get to our collaborative notes at that short link. You can also get to them, the direct space in our collaborative notes at the link I just put in the document. I would invite you to please enter your name there so we can be in touch with you, so we have a record of who attended this meeting. Really appreciate that. Okay, so short preview. So just a really brief background of this particular interest group. We are an interest group. We've been around for, I want to say since around Plenary 3 or 4, I think at this point in time. So we've been evolving as a group since then, and I would invite you to take a look at our wiki page within the Research Data Alliance site to take a look at some of our past work. Within the more recent time, we've been doing work around looking at resource collectors and metadata and thinking minimal metadata for educational resources. And we structured that in a way so that as an interest group, we could still get work done, and did this through a system of focus groups. So under the interest group umbrella, we have these two focus groups. One is the resources collectors and one is the minimum metadata. And there's a third one hanging back right now, which is the extended metadata. But frankly, it kind of it's waiting in the wings, if you will, to come onto stage once we've had a little bit more pick up and take up of the minimal metadata work. Now, within this space, as I mentioned, we've been doing this work for the last 18 months. And so previous stages of this work has been presented at earlier plenaries. And if you were part of those plenaries, you attended those meetings, so happy to have you back to take a look at where we are now and where we really hope to take this work within the implementation phases. I'm going to pause right now and see if there are any questions, either in chat or otherwise. We don't have a ton of people here today, so if you would like to unmute yourself and ask a question, that's great too. All right. Well, with that, I am going to pass the baton over to Maria. It looks like you're up.
Yes.
So please, thank you.
Yeah,
and take it away.
Thanks, Amy. Good evening. This is a very late evening. It's just past midnight here in Sweden. So I will share my screen to start off telling you about the focus group that we called Learning Resources Collectors. And you can see my screen now, and I will put it in presenter mode. Yes, there we have it.
Thank you.
Yes. Yes, we've been a focus group, yes, for nearly 2 years now, since June 2020. And we've met quite regularly, nearly on monthly basis. It's been quite an exploratory work in our group. We have been very much started off with discovering and searching for learning resources and different types of training materials within RDM. We had two challenges that we addressed quite early in the group. How can these repositories, training materials be more fair? And how do they look like, these resources that are coming and are around? What are their core characteristics? Yeah, the first time we've been very much searching for these resources and discussed within our meetings. And so we made an inventory of these training resources in research data management. That's an Excel list that we have on our webpage for the interest group. And it's been quite an different year. But however, the interest and I think the needs for these kinds of learning resources in research data management has been quite big. And it's even if, it has happened a lot during the year, of course, with the pandemic, but also both not only the needs, but also among the development of these kinds of resources, among the organizations offering these learning resources. And so it's been quite a moving target to work with, as this is very much of an expanding landscape, and not the least, many of the researchers needing these nowadays with kinds of resources. And we have two main outputs for our group, the inventory, as I just mentioned, of the training resources, and also a draft of characteristics of these resources, how to describe these kinds of resources. And we've been already discussed these outputs on two previous plenaries, RDA 16 and 17. And now we've come for more to an end with this work in this focus group. And our goal is to finalize the draft of characteristics document and develop that into a kind of a recommendation to RDA by the end of this year. And we have already received quite some feedback and comments on the draft of the characteristics, and hope to have some more today at this session. And we have actually a little Mentimeter poll here. So yes, now I might got through quite quickly with this background, but see, is there any, I can't see if there are any questions or in the chat. A little bit difficult here when I have it in presenter mode, but anyone
there is a question in the document here, Maria, and the question is, for the training resource group, has the COVID situation led to an acceleration in creating and publishing online RDM training resources? Are there more learning resource repos now than there were before?
We did our inventory very much in the beginning, so I'm not. We haven't so much looked into the past year or the past 6 months, but maybe a little bit more. But we haven't. We've been quite limited in our scope. We decided that we should mostly focus on catalogs and repositories of training material, but I've seen quite a lot around the training of RDM during this year, absolutely, in the way of developing other products and materials and so on. So I might have a feeling it's very much of an up and coming area anyhow in this, but we kind of stopped our inventory quite early in this and haven't so much looked into it. But it's a very relevant question, and I also thinking of it as some of you here also have run quite a lot of like this Zoom-based or online courses, and in general the interest for them has been quite high during this year by naturally. So that's good question.
Well,
yeah.
Go ahead, Maria, please.
Yeah. So we want to have there's a few questions here in the Menti, and you see the Menti code. You go to this menti.com and add the code, and there will be 2 questions around the core characteristics document, but also about how you think you can use it. So if not, we could go into this Menti right now if you want to, and I can in the meantime also log into and see about the answers of this mentor. We had this Mentimeter on the previous the first session, so there are already some answers in it, but we are very curious at your what you think, your opinion about it. Shall we have it in the chat also, the code?
Already in the chat. If you'd just like to go ahead and log in and share your screen, Maria, we can see what new ideas are being generated during this session to add to some of the other ideas that we had.
Then I just go out from this presentation and I go into the Menti. See, we have it here. If I can go, yeah. So you see it now.
No, we still see the presentation.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. If I just stop share. Sorry.
Yeah.
I go in again. That was odd.
So while Maria is finding that screen, I would encourage everyone to really think about, we've put the link to the characteristics list in there. Take a look at that and think about how you might consider implementing these core characteristics in your own situation, whether you are in the role of a learning resource collector, or perhaps you are more in the role of someone who goes out to learning resource collectors to find learning resources, and what types of characteristics you might find useful, or how you might use the characteristics that this group has put together to best present these materials to your communities, or thinking about how you might use them. Absolutely understand that, Allison. And yep, would encourage people to take some time. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, so we have some time. If you would like to take a look at those core characteristics, I would certainly encourage you to do that.
Is it possible to share the screen and just look at the document briefly while people are doing that, since we have a link to it? Is that something we could do? Because we could talk a little bit more about what the intention of it was and the audience.
Shall I share the draft, Nancy?
Right, the draft.
Yep,
Yes, yeah.
Yep. Do just a moment. Then I.
Okay, then Kat, let me take a look, please.
Sorry, yeah, I did type something in, but when
Thank you.
Maria shared her screen there, I didn't see anything, so I wasn't sure whether it got submitted.
So sorry.
Would you mind sharing what your question was, and I can tell you whether or not it got submitted?
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was an answer to the question you posed.
Okay.
So here we have, I have, it is a link to this. There is a link to this from our webpage on RDA webpage, but this is an offline. It is an offline copy of it. But you see here, we have a couple of sections, or say, types of.
Can I, Shelton, maybe I can add a little bit to it, just to, since I've been involved in helping to write it. So essentially, the core characteristics are describing catalogs, registries, portals, and those kinds of service providers that are either collecting together the learning resources, just to be able to make usually searchable interface available for people. One of the reasons that we decided, we thought that this would be useful to identify and try to describe was the fact that we observed in June 2020 that a lot of these kinds of organizations often have a limited life, possibly, I mean, often because of funding, but also because sometimes there may not be, enough information available on the sites in order for people to kind of have confidence in what they were seeing, what the quality of the inventory was, and what, and maybe not necessarily coming back. So part of the idea was to see if we could identify what kinds of characteristics would be useful for a service provider to make available if they had them, try to make some decisions about some things like governance and that sort of thing, and make, and make that a little bit more transparent. And then a searcher who's looking for learning resources would have some sense that, again, this is an organization or a service that might be there the next time they come around. So the focus has always been, mostly on the service providers themselves, with the secondary audience being the searcher who would be looking at those. So just to provide that as a perspective. We've gotten feedback from some of the service providers that currently exist with catalogs and registries. That's part of the feedback we need to incorporate into the final draft of it, which you can see that's where the comments are on the side too, to some extent. But if you come from a service provider or have had experiences, coming and going to different service providers and not seeing what you wanted to, then if there's information in here or characteristics in here that are either present and you want to say yay, or are missing and say, fill them in, that's the kind of feedback we'd love to get.
It is the same as the GDoc version, Venkat. I think this is just one that was easier for Maria to get to and show.
Yes.
But do please keep
really a draft, ongoing draft. Yeah.
So the timeline for this list of characteristics is we're hoping to get this out as an RDA supporting output by the end of the calendar year. So at least have it out there for the month-long community review that happens with RDA supporting outputs by the end of the calendar year. So we can have that established for the group and for the community as well. So really interested in getting your thoughts on this, certainly in either the GDoc, and the link to that GDoc is shared in the session notes and also on the wiki page, or please, thinking about one of the things that's really important for any of the products of RDA is really thinking about its implementation and how people are going to be actively using it in their setting. So I've seen a couple of different responses in the Menti and would encourage you to keep those coming. Lovely to see the idea around building badging schemes possibly to promote good learning resource repos, or the using it as a communication tool for developing a collection of resources for your community. Those are all good. Does anyone have any particular questions?
Can I stop sharing the core characteristics?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I do that.
Yeah,
yeah and yeah, good.
So Allison has a question in chat, and Allison is asking, saying, is this linked to Core Trust Seal in some way? And so I think I can confidently say that at this point, no, it is not. But it's really, one of the motivations for the work of this group is to acknowledge that there are repositories out there and there are well-established characteristics of repositories, and really to build on those for what is necessary for a successful repository that is mainly focused on learning resources and learning resources around research data management. So definitely, if you see similarities to the Core Trust Seal certification, that's intentional, and so glad you're picking up on those. But really trying to take those just a step beyond into the more focused area of research data management, research data, educational resources themselves. Nancy, Maria, anything you wanted to add on to that?
Yeah, the only thing I would say is that I think that we were focusing more on the fact that a lot of the catalogs and registries are actually not repositories, but the repository, because a lot of times the metadata they come up with is not necessarily their own, and so it might be a repository for metadata, but not for the learning resources themselves, and so that's an important distinction. I mean, there's obviously a connection between them, and we're hoping to convince some of the more well-known repositories that have learning resources to look at what we've come up with in terms of both core characteristics and the minimum metadata as well. But that's what I would add.
Thank you for that, Nancy, definitely. Venkat, to answer your question in chat about a hard deadline for review by the end of the calendar year, no, we don't have a hard deadline yet. Like I said, our goal for this group is to make sure that these, based on the feedback from the community that we've received during the plenary, to have these out for community review by the end of the calendar year, and then RDA processes themselves give the community another month of review within the RDA framework for community feedback, and then following that, they can continue on their path to become those supporting outputs that come out of interest groups. Maggie, I see you have your hand raised. Did you have a question you wanted to voice?
Yeah, I just wanted to make the comment that many of the stakeholders that are involved in providing or thinking about training and maybe funders of repositories, etc., they seem to be a little bit confused about what components are needed for this to be a successful venture, as you will. So in my mind, you sort of need three things to be able to provide good training and in a sustainable, secure way. And that's a repository for the actual learning resources, so the materials. You need a catalog so that you can expose this stuff. And then you need some kind of learning platform, which can be very simplistic, or it can be really advanced like Moodle or something like that. And actually, of course, the fourth thing is that you need good instructors and also interested students. So this division between cataloging and repository and a learning platform seems to be a bit muddled. So I don't know if the interest group could somehow make this, well, play a role in making this clearer. This, both the distinction between the three, but also sort of pointing out that you do need all three.
Particularly for sustainability, it's a good, I mean, that's one thing I think we didn't mention, that the whole point of the core characteristics was to help these different service providers, if we'll just call them that, would continue to be sustainable. So, and that was a question that you raised early on, Maggie. So this, having thought about it more as you have, it's a good thing to think about and add to the document. So thank you. Good suggestions.
Yeah, and I think that the repositories can use this classification and also their own score in it, so to speak, especially when you're looking at things like, as you said, sustainability, but also governance related aspects and sustainability. They can use that as good arguments towards their own funders and or organizations that are hosting them. I think that's very important, and especially since there now seems to be this tendency to withdraw funds from things that seem to be successful, because it will just continue to be successful, right? Doesn't need any funding. I mean, that's a horrible way to look at things.
Depending on your point of view, of course.
Thank you for that, Maggie. I'd like to move the group on now to the next question in the Menti. Let me just forward that to make sure. So the next question we have that I think you should be, if you go back to the menu or to the Menti again, is what new topics is around, nope, this is my bad. This is a question for a later date. This is a preview of a question we're going to ask you later, but I think it works well for this area as well, as within the learning resource collection and focusing on service providers, as Nancy, that you termed them. What are there particular new topics from the perspective of service providers that you think it would be good for this interest group to work on, and really thinking of those ways to continue to remove barriers, address the pain points that service providers, especially in the area of learning resource and learning resource collectors, to make their jobs easier. I think, Maggie, you brought out a great point that once things are successful, people start withdrawing funding, and so that might be one direction to pursue, is to enhance arguments for funding. And certainly if the core characteristics can work in that way, I think that would be a great outcome for the work from this group.
One thing that I've been thinking about too, from a service provider point of view, is we're starting to see some of this happen. Some of these codes for participation and codes of conduct that sometimes different organizations are starting to make available on their sites if they're service providers, especially with community involvement and so on. And it's an interesting question for this kind of service provider and or repository as well, because it's certainly possible that you can get things submitted, for instance, to your catalog that you you don't really want, if you've got your selection criteria set up, for instance, and guidelines, but if people still submit things that are resources that are not necessarily within your selection criteria, whether purposefully or not, then would a code for participation or a code for conduct, especially if there's assessment associated with the resources, if people have the opportunity to provide some annotation or some assessment, is that those kinds of guidelines be useful for people to see as part of what a service provider does? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. Thank you for that, Nancy, for that perspective. All right. Well, I think let us move on to the next focus group area. Thank you very much, the Learning Resource Collectors, for sharing your work there and walking through a little bit of the core characteristics. And thank you everyone else for participating as well in thinking about how you might implement these core characteristics, what they might mean for you in your particular situation. At this point, I'd like to pass the baton over to Nancy more directly, who is going to be presenting on the work of the minimal metadata group. So if you want to pull up your presentation there, Nancy.
Yes.
Excellent.
Okay. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay.
We are good to go. Thank you.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah. So the other focus group that is working in conjunction on these questions that came up in June of 2020 is one, as Amy mentioned, that is about recommending minimal metadata for learning resources. We started with minimal, although there's also recognized at least interest in discussing extended metadata and other kinds of documentation for learning resources. And part of what we were looking we decided to do was to break out the groups into two, but focus on minimal first. And also the discussions that we came up with, in the discussions, we decided that the purpose, kind of the goal for the minimal set was to facilitate discovery of the learning resources, whereas the extended documentation was more for reuse of them. So that's what we've started with in the beginning. So our goals were to identify a minimal set of metadata descriptors that could be recommended as important for resource users from different learning perspectives. So if you're coming from a formal, like you have a need for formal education or informal education or again, professional development, for instance, professional education, we wanted to be able to provide descriptors that would allow people to discover those who are interested in them. And also from from different perspectives in terms of the roles that you have towards learning resources. So are you a learner? Are you a trainer? And even although a learner can be a trainer and vice versa, service providers, funders, and developers. So our goal was to look at all of those and then come up with a core set that could be adopted by resource creators really and service providers. And then also to help reduce the duplication, identify gaps among the existing inventories or perspectives of the service providers that are already existent and that are being planned for the future. So the process we used was to first do a mapping of metadata schemas across some of the most commonly used schemas that for people who were coming to the group really, and and also out there in the universe, so of teaching and learning. So we looked at the Dublin Core and Schema, Dublin Core Maintained Learning Resource Metadata Initiative. We looked at the LOM and the INVRE's a profile of the LOM, Learning Object Metadata. EOSC had a pilot set of minimal metadata at the time we started this, that also was part of the mapping. And then bioschemas, which is this schema behind a number of resources, including tests, I think, and also the DRESI too. I think too, Allison, I think you're coming from there, is using that as well. And then schema.org as well, because both bioschemas and LRMI are, as I think our LOM are kind of mapped also to schema.org. So we created a massive spreadsheet that's that mapped across those, and then started looking at user stories. So again, I mentioned these before, but from the perspective of learners, trainers, service providers, developers, and funders. And we did some mapping to the FAIR principles as well, although most of the discussion about any of the letters other than F for findable are, we're probably going to have to be dealing with more in the extended group, but we did some mapping across that as well, and that shows up on the spreadsheet. And then we've gotten community feedback from different RDA plenary sessions, comparison to other recommendations that have been made in different articles and so on, that for minimal sets, and then also, again, looked at the set that we can have come up with from the different learner perspectives of formal, informal, and professional education. So what that in the process, we did the mapping, the first mapping, we had 84 elements. We did the crosswalk exercise and went down to 80. And then we really honed it down to 12 by looking at the user stories and actually focusing on the first three, really, the learner, trainer, and service provider. And then with our user feedback, we bumped it back up to 14. So right now we have 14 elements that were considered minimal. And let's see, I was going to mention something else and I forgot what it was now. And all of these materials are available in a report that we've got, the link to which is here, and this whole presentation is in the folder. I think Amy mentioned that as well. But this is basically the set, a picture of the set in a heart-shaped form. Our graphic artist came up with it, which some didn't notice, including me at the very beginning. But so these are the 14 different elements, looking at which ones were descriptive, which ones are about access, and which ones are about educational information. In this report, there's a link to more information about the set with definitions, another visual, a description of what we did over the 18 months. There's a data dictionary, which includes both definitions, some constraints, not as much as we probably will need, we think, but good information there and examples. And then there are other, we've got snapshots of the important parts of these different background documents for you to look at if you're interested in them. We including the mappings and the user stories and so on and so forth. So that's what we've got at the moment. We've got our work isn't quite finished yet, even from the point of view of the minimal set, in that we intend to develop a metadata application profile for use by service and infrastructure providers using a double core tabular application profile, which will be able to take the spreadsheet we've got and map that to a profile. And the idea is that then different service providers can, either new ones or people who are organizations that are interested in adopting this, can look to see how the minimal set can be mapped to their own, some of the other schemas in particular. And then we also have an information test bed that we're working with. We hope to finish both of these by the end of this year, actually, but they're not resources from 9 different catalog and service providers to look and to map the metadata that's created, that they've got created, and map it to the minimal set to see what kinds of issues come up with for implementation. So that should be quite interesting. And then we're also looking for other service providers who are interested in adopting what we've got. We're encouraging that. We're soliciting feedback. That's part of what we'll be doing, both here and then in the next few months. We've already got a number of platforms that are interested in working with adopting the minimal set, the EOSC Future catalog, Open Air, the Social Sciences and Humanities Training Discovery Toolkit, various national training programs, including one in Slovakia and Germany. And then, if anyone else is interested in that would be great. We're really interested in finding out how this would work and what would be the best, what needs to be changed with it. and then of course we want to hand off that minimal set to the extended group to really look at more closely both at FAIR and at reuse. How do we get these learning resources to be reused? So I think that's about it. You can join, certainly welcome to have people join our interest group. Watch for the startup of that extended documentation group. Tell us about your stories, and add your thoughts to the plenary discussion. And actually, I think part of one of the questions we wanted to discuss today too, and Amy will, I'm sure, mention this more, but if you can imagine what kinds of implementation issues might come up, that would be helpful too. We know there are things like problems with control vocabularies, for instance, and possibly, some more specifics about constraints on the terms, for author, for instance. Should there be guidance about last name first, first name last, that kind of thing that is important from the service provider point of view, and also from the searching point of view as well. So those are just a couple little things to throw out. We'd love to hear more from people about what they're thinking. So that's all I've got. I'll stop share and go from there.
That's great. Thank you very much for that, Nancy. Really appreciate that. So I'd like to open the floor now, and we don't have a mentee for this part of our session. So please, I welcome you to take yourself off mute, turn on your camera if you like. You don't have to. There's no pressure here for that. Who knows what time it is where you are. You don't have to turn your camera on. But please do take yourself off mute, and let's start a discussion about both of these efforts, these products these groups have come up with. And as both Nancy and Maria mentioned, really the focus that we have right now is thinking about how this work can best be implemented. What are the challenges that you think you might face? What are some of the opportunities you see in these spaces? And lovely to see you. Go ahead, Allison.
Sorry. Yes, hello, everybody. I should put my hand down before I leave it up for the next hour. I'll have to leave a little bit early, I'm sorry, despite the good time of day. So apologies to all you Europeans. Look, I'm interested. I'm actually looking at this a bit from outside, and that was why I was getting a bit confused with the word repository. The use of a repository for a home, shall we say, for all of these training resources versus the repository, namely the data repository that needs to keep its users au fait with how to approach them, how to do the best data management plan. So when they're ready to deliver their data, for example, it's only for example, they've done it well. So I think that sort of link was what I was talking about. But I love this document. I'm in a project where we have been dealing with the data research interface with my colleague Shelley Stall, among others, Margaret O'Brien, and of course I've come from a Data One experience. And look, there are words and there are things here that are way outside, that are valuable way outside, I think, what your intention is. And your metadata document, I'll pick on that because that was last, is great. Some of those basic definitions are just wonderful for the average Joe Blow researcher. One of the things that loses me, for example, is what is a schema? And I've put that in the question, and sorry for this long prelude. I've put that in the chat. The word schema is a bit of a in-group term, if I may say, and I know why they've been developed. I'm a bit outside, so I always stumble a bit, and I said, because there's also the, the vocabulary schema that's so famous. Anyway, yeah, so I would actually spend a little time in your document talking about your lovely steps and why you compared those schema, because they've arrived, they've been generated by humans, for their particular purpose. And I think that in itself will be very helpful for when someone is looking more at the repository level, perhaps, to what they might link to. So is that, I can see Nancy and a couple of other, Maria's a bit more in the dark, physically, not in the dark, but nodding a bit. So I'll stop talking, but thank you. It's really fascinating. Thank you.
So may I ask a question to clarify a little bit your question? So it sounds like what you're what I'm hearing you say is that the term schema is not something that a researcher would necessarily know means, right? So turn that term itself and what we've done into something that isn't so
I would,
jargony. Is that
yes
right?
and no. I don't be afraid of the jargon. You can. This is transdisciplinarity, if you like, or
Right.
interdisciplinarity. It's all good.
Right.
But I would think it would be worth spending a little time. You picked on a comparison of 4 or so different schema. That's of interest in itself, and also understanding what this term schema means. Because then when they go to, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten my vocabulary schema. It's a programming schema.
It's not SCOS, is it? Is it
yeah,
SCOS?
SCOS,
Yeah,
for example.
yes.
SCOS, when someone goes to SCOS, they'll already know. So it's a crosswalk educational exercise. It'll never be wasted. Not very long, because that isn't the point of your exercise. But you know, I know some repositories who are, and people, not so much the researchers, but repositories who are busy doing their own thing, and not in learning exercises, but you know, the researcher, why will they choose a learning exercise? They will try and choose something that teaches something relevant to their repository of choice, their data repository of choice, or something, or their community repository. And so they will be looking at that, and they'll end up, and some of the repositories will morph, and that'll make your explanation document, I think, more sustainable and generalizable. There you go. Generalizable is the word.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah. Good points.
Thank you for that, Alison, very much. Venkat,
Hi.
yes.
Yeah. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Thanks, Nancy, and all of you indeed. Yeah, excellent work. And I don't really have as many real questions right now. I just want to reassure you that I work for OpenAir now, and we are very much looking at using what you guys have produced, both for OpenAir and also for the EOS Future project. So I'm also involved in that.
Great.
So the package 9 in EOS Future, that's what I'm involved in. And indeed, Maggie is involved in as well, I know. And of course, Irina, of course, too.
And the Chia is too, I think, right? The Chia Vaira.
The Chia.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Is she in this group too?
She is, yeah. Yeah, she's our graphic artist.
Right.
She's got many talents.
I see. Yeah, I mean, this is a big group. I can't remember who's all in it. Unfortunately, I've not been able to participate enough in previous meetings, but because of my involvement in these projects right now, I will be looking into this further. And indeed, it's very timely what you've been doing, and the timeline for what we are thinking of doing in OpenAir and in EOS Future. So I will quite likely be in touch, but of course, Irina's there too. And it's interesting what you said earlier as well, Nancy, about the findability. I know you meant that that's what you've done initially in terms of your mapping, but I find it's anecdotal perhaps, but I think that the findability is probably the most difficult and important thing when it comes to the resources. When you're talking about discoverability of these resources, it really frustrates me when there are things deposited in, for example, Zenodo, and Zenodo's great, but it's a mess. It's just got so many things in there, and trying to find anything is, it's awful.
Yes.
And you know, it's partly the fault of the depositor, and maybe just the way the repository is set up too. I don't know. That's another debate. But with all these fragmented resources out there, finding them, I think, is the big question. And yeah, this is hopefully what we're trying to address, both in OpenAir and EOS Future and whatever else too, of course. So yeah, no, it's just an observation, I guess.
Yeah, great. That's really helpful. Yeah, I mean, one of the things we've definitely talked about is with a minimal set, if a number of repositories for these things, these learning resources, can use those same terms, then at least, you know, you'd have some prayer of asking in your searches, looking for, you know, learning outcomes, for instance, or if something's even there as a learning outcome, then you have a pretty good chance of thinking that it might be a learning resource. So they're definitely one group that we've been thinking about, put it that way, and hopefully we'll adopt, work with us to see if they'll adopt some of this as well. So that's good to hear.
And actually, what Alison just mentioned there, I agree. And it was actually something that occurred to me earlier on. How much have you thought about, yes, retrofitting what you're doing? And are you tailoring it more for materials of the future, or are you trying to encourage? I mean, it's such a can of worms to try and go back in time and try and annotate things.
Well, I think we talked about that some, and we actually had a good conversation about that the last session as well. Somebody asked that same question, and I mean, I think that hopefully, you know, most of the service providers who are, you know, providing metadata for, or you know, either they're scraping or they're finding metadata for these kinds of things, have got some, you know, most of these elements. That's part of, you know, what the mapping did, was to identify ones that are pretty common across the four schemes at least that we looked at. But there may be a couple that are not. I mean, my own, I'm an editor of the Data Management Training Clearinghouse that the Earth Science Information Partners started. And we've got our scheme is pretty close, but we don't have learning outcomes, and we're going to have to, you know, see if we can add that. Now, in our situation, we're in a pretty good position to do it because we're in the middle of a restructuring, rebuilding of our infrastructure anyway, and so it might be possible to, you know, just add that one. But it's also, you know, people who are creating the resources are not necessarily putting them in, you know, so you can't necessarily find the outcomes, or, you know, some of those elements that are included. So it'll be a problem of not just the service providers trying to, you know, catch up, so to speak, with what the minimal set is, but also the people who are creating resources are going, oh, I guess I should put some learning outcomes in here too, even if it's a, you know, a webinar or something like that. It's a practice that shows the maturity of education in this kind of informal area, you know, our research data management and data skills in general. So it'll be an interesting evolution to see how that works.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point as well, Nancy. It's almost like a soft influence there to try to push our trainings into something that's a little bit more pedagogically, andragogically proper, if you will, by having documented learning outcomes for our different trainings and workshops and so on and so forth. So I think it's a necessary push for the field of people who are developing these trainings in any case, and hopefully having that as a minimal metadata element will make people think a little bit more about potentially including some of those.
Right. That's the hope.
I was just going to say, sorry, Alison, before you get to say, I'll just talk about learning outcomes and things like that. I'm assuming you probably know about the First Fair project, Fair Adoption Handbook that's being written at the moment, and it's got lesson plans and learning outcomes and things like that in it. So that's actually hopefully going to be published by the end of the year. So that should be quite useful.
Add it as a reference to our report, maybe.
There we go. Excellent. Thank you for that, Venkat. Alison, please go ahead.
Yes, and I will stop shortly because I've got to go on a trip to the country. So this will be my last effort. I'm interested over the last few years. I was engaged with Data One. It's one of their user group members from 2010. And we were looking at, over that period of time, the next 10 years or 11 years, the growth of data science courses at universities. Some for professional data managers and data scientists, just enormous growth. It's happening in Australia at the moment. It's the latest fad for smaller universities to engage in. And I'm wondering about, okay, there's a bit less for people in other disciplines, certainly for them to do short courses and catch-ups. They're not going to become professionals, but some of this would be important. So you do have audience, but I'm wondering if you have a built-in obsolescence factor in that eventually everyone will know how to do data management plans and know about metadata and all these wonderful things because they will have learnt it at their grandmother's knee. Now, to put it metaphorically.
I delight in that world. However, in libraries, we're still teaching information literacy, and one would have only hoped that that would also been learned at their grandmother's knee. But unfortunately, no. So
you don't
would
see that.
love that to be the world that we operate in the future. But I think we do have a certain amount of security in continuing to offer research data management training, if only because of the variety of experience of research of what people experience as research data management training. And especially if you go from field to field, there will be differences in what those practices are, as we've seen that level of disciplinarity, the specificity in different disciplines. So I certainly, I dream of obsolescence. that would be brilliant. That would be great. I'm not sure it will happen in my lifetime, but let's shoot for that. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
I would love to see. I mean, I personally, I also teach in a learning analytics program. So it's like data science for education, right? And I teach the research data management course. And even when I am done, I know those people will need more help.
Yes, and my last shot, I was going to put it in the chat, but I'm going to save the chat anyway for myself as I leave, is educational embeddedness. One of the things that you've got is, and I was trying to remember I taught for 30 years uni students, and also, and the difference between someone who knocks up a course, you know, oh, they've got to know this and know that, and an educator who actually does it is something that I think is a branding that can be quite a good distinguishing factor. And I think, yeah, so that's all. But look, this is great. I shall watch all the wonderful tools, and thank you very much indeed. And I'm sorry I have to go, but thank you everybody and for staying up.
Thank you for that, Alison, and thank you for showing up. Much appreciated. Have a good rest. Have a good rest of your waking hours. Definitely. Whatever those waking hours might be for you. And I'm trying to get down Alison's last comment, and it was about distinguishing between, I think what I might say is our crossover between the professionalization of data stewards versus perhaps researchers or students who learn basic good practices. And that's kind of the thing. Would you agree with that? Okay. Great.
Well, the other thing that she said, though, that I think is interesting, and hopefully we can follow up a little bit, is noting the difference between an educator versus a person who comes up with a little more informal training. And I think she's talking about the professionalization of education on this topic as well. So maybe that's related to the badge concept. I'm not sure. I didn't get a chance to look at that yet, but one of the things that, I mean, you mentioned it as well, Amy, is that soft influence of, and I think that's partly what Alison was responding to as well, that, you know, if people understand that there's more to educating from a kind of a professional point of view than just putting up some slides, that it's important to, you know, have objectives and outcomes and all that sort of thing, then that would be useful. And I think what she was saying, that going on to the badge concept, if it's related, is noting, in other words, kind of identifying experts in the areas of you know, maybe different skills, maybe different competencies, but also noting when kind of recognizing people as experts in areas, including being educators. So it looks like Maggie's got some thoughts there too.
Yeah, I was involved a little bit in the work to produce this Fair is Fair handbook document that Venkat was mentioning earlier. Unfortunately, not as much as I would have wanted. But one of the things that did come up for discussion there was really that training on the job, so to speak, at least in academia, is happening all the time, but is not always in the formal setting of an educational activity. So for instance, you could have someone who is like a research engineer or something like that, who is actually the real expert on how to enter data or metadata into a system. And that person would often be working together with also master students, but certainly graduate students and postdocs who are coming in and not being familiar. So it's very important also to strengthen the credit that is given to people. So to all the actors that are involved in really producing as a whole this data stewardship environment, we need. There must be recognition of the effort that people are putting in, and of course also that you can have these softer skills or something like that. It's not all about the bits and the bytes and the file structures and things. There are so many other things that go into the trade, so to speak. And you have to not only have a toolbox, but you have to be familiar with using all the tools where appropriate, so that you don't try to put the screw in using a hammer or something like that. But at the same time, and I think Maria also knows this because we have been together in a teaching team that is trying to learn or teach introductory research data management to graduate students in the natural science faculty in Lund. And there are so many misconceptions and weird ideas and also maybe almost a fear of getting things wrong, so that people are not necessarily engaging in this, and they are so reliant on the advice they are getting from their thesis advisor or other more senior people in the group. But when they are lost, then everyone is lost or is believing in fake news or stuff like that. It's almost as bad as the vaccination, anti-vaxxers, as anti-farers and anti-open sciences people, but they are basing their ideas and misconceptions on completely false information. So how do we get there? And that's why this RDM training is so incredibly important. So if we can help people find the right resources by our work here with the minimal metadata and also the repository guidelines, I think that's taking a huge, or at least building the potential for a huge step forward. Lots of words. I'll shut up and return to lurking.
I think it is important as well to make people realize, just as some people in some fields of research or whatever it might be, don't think of what they're dealing with as data, that people may forget about these learning materials to treat them as data, and with the same methods that you would use for scientific outputs, whatever. And I think it can be easily overlooked as a result.
I think that's an important point there, Venkat, is that when we're considering the creation of training resources and also the labeling of them for findability, that not everyone thinks of what they're doing as research necessarily or as using data necessarily. So being careful, again, how we describe these so that they can, the resources can be more generalizable, they can be more findable across multiple disciplines. Okay, well, thank you all very much for the discussion in this area. It's been great. And I would like to move us now on to our next phase of interactions. And this is really talking about what the future of this particular interest group is and where we might go. And for this, we do have a Menti. The Menti is back for this. And the question, let me find the link. I know there's a link in chat up here that I can just copy and it will be super easy. I found it. If you, by any chance, lost the Menti link, it is here now in the chat. And so our next question up in this conversation is, what new topics, generally speaking, would you like to see this interest group work on? And it really does work into some of those areas we've already brought up around what are the challenges that you're experiencing? What are the pain points that you have? What are those issues that you're like, you know, this is just not going to work for me to do it on my own, either because you need collaboration, you need different perspectives, things like that, where it's really something that this group can step into that role, step into that space as a community to help lift each other out of this particular challenge or build a bridge across it, or whatever metaphor you want. Make one that makes you happy for where you are, but really support each other in addressing the challenges that we perceive in the areas that we're currently working in. And I would share my screen with the Mentimeter, but I'm also taking notes. So many challenges there. So if someone else, I don't know, Maria, if you want to.
Yeah, I can share. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Two comments at least.
So while we're thinking about that, thinking about how you'd like to engage with the interest group, oh, interesting. Sorry, too many things. So first about the Menti, I think you should be seeing at this point, the question is, what new topics would you like this interest group to work on, but perhaps you are not? And if you're not, please unmute yourselves and answer the questions. What new topics would you like this interest group to work on? You can see some of the other ideas that have been brought up. I think the idea of languages was an important one. Particularly, we tend to be a little bit Anglophonic, certainly, and there are many other languages that this information needs to be accessed in. So thinking about developing training materials in different languages, or thinking about how to develop training materials so that they can be easily translated to different languages as well.
The citation question is a good one too. But how to cite, somebody put that in, including license. It's probably something that would be included in the extended group, but yeah.
I'm sorry, I probably put the comment that I placed in the other page of the Menti, which was how would you like to engage with the IG? But just going on the languages comment there, yeah, I mentioned low and middle income countries and trying to engage these more, which I think is kind of the same thing, partly at least, and also someone's mentioned Latin America there. And yeah, I think that is actually something that's very important. And indeed, going back to what others were saying just a few moments ago about trying to get researchers to trust RDM as well, things like that, I think, as well as language issues with places like you might find in LMICs, it's not just language, there is a trust issue as well, especially with a lot of the work being created or done here in Europe and North America, Australia. How do you translate that better to try and be more inclusive?
That idea of creating an inclusive space of activity for RDM, for research data management, and how to extend that. Any other particular pain points people might have or challenges that they see in the space? All right.
I just wanted to say one thing about the comment that, again, about the situating training materials within a particular context. The person who's a data manager and trainer in Latin America, we had a woman two plenaries ago, maybe, who had some really good, and some of her colleagues had some really good points about that. We invited her to join, one of our meetings, and really got a better sense of what was meant with that. So in those kinds of contexts, including, not just geographic locations, but kind of regionality within even a geographic area. So that that's something that I hope we can work with quite a bit more, including implementation. Maybe that's a place to really see if we can find some adopters of people who'd be interested in implementing in their own catalog, and with a minimal set as an example. Because it would, I think that the more we know about what the issues are and how, to have a better sense of what could be done or how it could be solved, or at least improved, put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I think that's a great point. Thank you for that, Nancy. I think that really moves on to the next Menti question. Maria, if you would be so kind as to advance us to you have the power. Yes. It doesn't work when I do it. So I'm so glad Maria is here with the Menti power. How would you like to engage with the interest group? And we're really looking, especially as you noted, Venkat, is that there's a lot of work that we are aware of having been done in North America, Europe, Australia, particularly, but really trying to engage with the work that we also know has been done in other parts of the world, so that we can have a more effective exchange of knowledge and experience to strengthen our community overall with that. So thinking about ways for how would you like to engage with the interest group? What are other ways that you can think about extending the engagement of the interest group as well? We invite those thoughts both in the Menti, but also if you'd like to speak up about that too.
The workshops idea is a great one. The regional workshops in different areas, in different kinds of organizations too. It's a great idea.
And I think there's, there are opportunities there, Nancy, to for the interest group, for members of the interest group, definitely to reach out to other groups within RDA about that. Certainly, there are the regional groups within RDA, and there are just more every time I look. So I don't have the list off the top of my head. I think there's a German one, there's a French one, but also there are the communities of practice, the disciplinary communities of practice within RDA. So, and I know some of them have started talking about training around research data within those specific disciplines. So I think this is an area of opportunity for us as well to reach out to those groups and make sure that we're benefiting from the wheels that have already been invented, if you will.
I'm going to poke my head up and say that as someone who's very new to the thinking of this group, I'm finding really important for me to develop a better mental model of the scope of the work that you all engage in. And especially given the way that my work, I work at CZI, Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and I'm supposed to be supporting biomedical researchers and better data management practices as a part of my role. And figuring out ways that I can leverage information from other communities to be able to, inform the work that I'm doing and also be able to share those learnings back out is really important to me. And I'm learning how the specific scaffolding around ideas that you all have been developing can bolster that work and help me fill in some of the gaps. Figuring out exactly how to dig through the wealth of information that is available. And honestly, my background is in biology, and learning how you all think is also, a learning curve in and of itself, and one that I'm very happy to engage in. But also then like I see my role now as figuring out how I can translate lessons learned from all of you so that my community can then engage in it, because I'm also, sort of supporting individuals who are trying to, share out the knowledge. So it's like multiple levels of complexity and multiple layers of sort of like higher level and meta level organizational thinking that I'm trying to integrate within the work that I do. So I wanted to thank you for all of that, and glad that I could be a fly on the wall long enough until I felt like I had cohesive thoughts that I could say with my actual voice.
Well, thank you for sharing your actual voice, Kate. Really appreciate that. And please, at any time, as you've no doubt detected from my own performance today, you don't necessarily have to be cohesive. It's great when you can be. But often sharing those non-cohesive thoughts could help other people think too. So happy to have your contributions in this. And I would invite you into this space more frequently. I think I've put out some links for our Slack, and you're welcome to join other groups and areas of discussion in that as well. So lovely to have you aboard. I think you make a great point around oftentimes we exist in our bubble, and making those efforts to think about translation, not just of languages, but also of the mental models that we tend to that we might find ourselves very conversant in, but might be quite foreign to others, and thinking about how to facilitate the translation of those to other spaces. And I think, to your point, Kate, that this is definitely an area where we could really benefit from having some more open, upfront conversations with some of our partners in the communities of practice groups as well, in thinking about, in trying out, testing with them the minimal metadata models that we've developed around learning resources, and saying, okay, so, as Nancy described, we adopted some of these from the bioschema languages. So with any luck, that makes it easier to translate to some of the biology areas, but you never know. But thinking about some of those things as well.
If I may, I just
Yes,
had more of a question here. So Amy, you mentioned different bits of RDA that could be engaged, but I don't think you mentioned other RDA interest groups or working groups. And how much has this group engaged with others? And I'm sure you're members of other groups, of course, but things like the professionalizing data stewardship interest group, for example, and any other education related or fair related, of course, groups. And I'm assuming there's some conversations going on there.
You're right. There are conversations going around there, and it was actually during the last session when we were talking about plans for P19, one of the areas that we talked about is really making sure to reach out to those groups to have co-sponsored meetings with the libraries groups, the data professionalization groups, some of the other groups to talk about the work that we've been doing, how it interacts with the work of those groups as well. So your remark is spot on with the areas of conversation that we've been entertaining.
Okay.
All right. And of course, if welcome the ideas for which groups we should be connecting with across these areas. So beyond those, I think the Fair groups, as you said, Venkat, the data steward professionalization, we've talked about some of the community of practice groups as well. So one of the things we'll be working on in the next few months, I'm guessing, is going to be putting together some plans for outreach and connection to those groups and trying to leverage our own connection to those too. So if you are a member of one of those groups and you're like, hey, I can help out with that, please do let us know, because we'd be delighted to have that assistance in creating those connections. All right.
So actually,
yeah,
I think also some of the maybe more how to say, data focus groups or technology focus groups like the PID interest group could also be a really good thing to maybe not have a plenary session together with, but simply to approach whether we could have a co-sponsored normal working meeting together with some experts from there. And also the data granularity group, they're also really good touching points there about especially related to citation, I think, citation of parts of larger resources, etc. I think we could combine our efforts there.
Thank you for that, Maggie. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for showing up, for participating so generously. Really appreciate this. Really appreciate the exchanges that we've been able to have today. I would invite you once again, join the group, hang out. You can lurk if you want. We're cool with lurking. We're great with contributing. You might find something that you're really interested in. You're like, I cannot let that pass without comment because. So make sure that you are available for those opportunities to provide your comment and your opinions and the work that's being developed and the work that we hope to develop within this group as we continue on thinking about education and training in the space of handling research data. I hope you all have a lovely, whatever the rest of your awake time is. Maria, I hope yours is very, very short, the rest of your awake time. The rest of you, I don't have a comment on. Maggie, yours as well. And thank you once again for participating. I'll leave the meeting open, I think, for another 4 minutes, but thank you once again. If you have any other questions about the working of the group or things like that, happy to answer those.
Thank you for
thank you all.
Nice discussions. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Yeah,
Good
thanks
night.
everyone.
Very good
Good night.
discussion.